At 1,407 local time, two FA-18 Super Hornets were screaming across the desert at full military power, closing on three irreplaceable Iranian aircraft sitting exposed on the apron at Kerman Airport. Overhead, a Reaper drone circled in lazy orbits, its sensors feeding live footage back to the strike group. What the sensor operator saw wasn't good. The Iranians were scrambling, ground crews were moving, fuel trucks were lurching clear, and the clock was compressing fast. Both pilots, Raven 1 and Raven 2, had planned their ingress carefully, swinging wide east through the Baluchistan corridors to avoid the known threat rings. The desert didn't cooperate. Raven 1's ALR-67 radar warning receiver, the system that tells a pilot exactly who's hunting him and how seriously lit up with a tone that every fighter pilot memorizes in training and spends a career hoping never to hear for real. Phased array acquisition. Fast pulse repetition. A Tormone battery inside 12 kilometers. The battery had been sitting cold in the foothills, radar off, completely silent, the missile defense equivalent of a bouncer sitting in the darkest corner of a club, arms crossed, watching the door. No small talk, no warning look across the room. The instant the Super Hornets crossed the horizon, it skipped the search phase entirely and went straight to fire control. No, who are you? No, can I see some ID? Just a fist already in the air before you finished walking through the door. Raven 1's hands were already moving. Left hand to the chaff switch, right hand tightening on the stick. Think of the incoming missile as a telephone pole doing Mach 2.8 that pulls 28 Gs in the terminal phase, roughly 4 times what the pilot can sustain before the lights go out. The phased array radar hops frequencies faster than most jammers can follow, like trying to hold a conversation with someone who changes languages mid-syllable. The surviving Iranian crews had learned exactly one trick across 11 days of war. Fire once, shut down, and run before the Americans can shoot back. Raven 1 hauled the stick into his lap and pulled 6 Gs. The horizon whipped vertical, the desert floor filled his canopy, and behind him, the ALE-47 dispenser cycled chaff aluminum-coated fibers, blooming into a radar ghost, the exact same size as the jet. The ALQ-214 jammer simultaneously pumped false range data into the tracking frequency, pointing the missile at empty air 500 meters behind the aircraft. Raven 2 broke the opposite direction, splitting the formation and forcing the battery crew to choose one target. They chose Raven 1. The chaff and the jammer's false data corrupted the tracking solution, while 6 Gs of geometry shift moved the jet clean out of the seeker's prediction cone. The warhead detonated behind and below shrapnel distance, no impact, but close enough to tickle the airframe and ruin your flight suit. Inside the Tormone, the battery commander slammed the master switch, and the scope went dark. The driver was already engaging tracks beneath them. 2 weeks ago, the commander would have fired again without hesitation. But 11 days of watching American precision munitions turn Iran's military infrastructure into modern art installations had given him second thoughts. The battery had fired once. That was enough, because the Tormone didn't need a hit. It needed 45 seconds. The 6G break threw both jets 12 miles south of their planned ingress route, out of the empty desert corridor, and into the foothills, directly into the coverage arc of an Iranian surveillance radar operator who had set up in a mountain pass and was quietly scanning to the southeast. He'd driven his mobile unit out of Isfahan province ahead of the first week's strikes, positioning himself in terrain the coalition hadn't prioritized a move that required either exceptional initiative or exceptional paranoia. In Iran's military, the two were often indistinguishable. He couldn't shoot anything down. He didn't need to. He picked up the handset and gave Kerman exactly what his scope was showing. 2 fighter-sized returns, heading northeast, medium altitude, moving with the kind of purpose that meant someone's day was about to get significantly worse. That phone call, routed through a landline because 11 days of American strikes had turned Iranian military communications into the world's most expensive game of telephone, reached the IRGC garrison before the Ravens finished, reassembling their formation. While that report raced toward the airfield, Raven 2 discovered what 6 Gs had done to his targeting pod. The ATF-LAR's gimbal uses fiber optic gyroscopes to hold the infrared image rock steady, compensating for every movement the aircraft makes at 500 knots. 15 seconds at 6 Gs had precessed those gyroscopes completely off their reference. The image now jittered across the desert floor like trying to read a street sign through a bus windshield on a gravel road. He cycled the pod to standby. The jitter persisted. What Raven 2 didn't know, what nobody would confirm until the maintenance debrief back aboard the Lincoln, was that the gyroscopes hadn't just precessed. The 6G snap had microfractured the fiber optic coupler feeding the reference laser. The pod wasn't drifting, it was guessing. The Tormone's 45 seconds were still compounding, and they were about to force Raven 2 into the altitude band where every ground defense Iran still had worked best. At Kerman, a ground controller grabbed a field telephone, listened for 4 seconds, and sprinted across the apron. Fuel trucks lurched clear of wheel chocks within moments a response time that would have impressed any Air Force on Earth, especially from crews who had spent 11 straight days watching American precision munitions systematically dismantle everything around them. Inside the IL-76's cockpit, the flight engineer was already throwing switches on the overhead panel. APU start sequence. The beginning of the 4 to 5 minute spool that feeds compressed air to each of the 4 Soloviev turbofans at roughly 90 seconds per engine. If every step went right, the heavy transport could be taxiing before the Americans arrived. 8,000 miles away at Creech Air Force Base, the Reaper sensor operator watched the scramble unfold in real time and keyed the satellite link. Activity at the target. Engine start on the heavy. Recommend immediate. Then the Reaper's fuel state crossed bingo, 20 hours on station, longer than most people spend awake in a single day, and the mission wasn't done, but the gas was gone. The operator swept the apron one last time stamped the frame, and turned south toward Djibouti. The screen went to empty desert. The replacement Reaper was 30 minutes out. The Ravens were 25. For the next 5 minutes, nobody on the American side could see Kerman Airfield. The Ravens held their orbit while fuel burned, and the IL-76 crew raced through their checklist with nobody watching. But here's what the Americans couldn't see during those 5 blind minutes. The IL-76 wasn't just spooling engines to evacuate. Ground crews were loading crates through the rear cargo ramp, long, olive green cases that didn't match any standard supply manifest. Whatever the IRGC was trying to fly out of Kerman was worth more to them than the aircraft itself. The CAOC, the Combined Air Operations Center, air traffic control for the entire war, held the Ravens in orbit. No ISR coverage meant no weapons release authorization. Standard procedure that made perfect sense from a headquarters 900 miles away where the coffee was hot and the ejection seats were theoretical, and made no sense at all from the cockpit of an aircraft burning fuel it couldn't spare. At Kerman, those same 5 minutes bought the garrison everything it needed. Zu-23 gun trucks were rolling from the motor pool before the first orbit completed. By minute 3, a MISOC-2 man-portable missile team stood on the maintenance hangar roof with a launch tube on the operator's shoulder. The MISOC-2 is Iran's copy of the Chinese QW-1, which was itself China's copy of the Russian Igla, which makes it a photocopy of a photocopy. And like any third-generation knockoff, it works just well enough to ruin your afternoon. The replacement Reaper checked in at 23,000 feet in MQ-9 with a multispectral targeting system capable of reading a license plate from 4 miles up, controlled by a sensor operator in a trailer at Creech, through what amounts to a very expensive gaming setup with a 600 millisecond satellite delay. The operator slewed the turret to the apron, and the picture came in clean. All 3 aircraft confirmed. APU hot on the heavy, hold released. 16 minutes to target. The broken targeting pod and the 5-minute head start, both courtesy of the Tormone, were waiting at the other end. Raven 1 swept the airfield with his ATF-LIR pod, essentially a thermal telescope that lets a pilot study a target from far enough away that the people on the ground cannot shoot back. His pod was clean, producing a stable surgical image. 2 pickup trucks with twin-barreled Zu-23 anti-aircraft guns sat at opposite ends of the runway, north and south. The Zu-23 fires 23mm rounds at 800 to 1,000 per minute per barrel. No radar, no signature on the radar warning receiver, the AK-47 of anti-aircraft weapons. The gunner doesn't aim so much as saturate the sky and let physics do the rest. 70 meters away on the maintenance hangar roof, the MISOC-2 operator was plainly visible on the Reaper's infrared feed. Launch tube on his shoulder, already reading the intercept geometry. Between the Zu-23s hosing the approach corridors and the man-portable missile waiting for engine exhaust, Kerman's defenses had formed a clean tactical equation. Come in high, and GPS jamming ruins your bomb. Come in low, and the ground defenses ruin your day. The GBU-38 JDAMs, they carried 500-pound GPS-guided bombs with a circular error probable of 5 meters under clean conditions, were being defeated by Chinese-supplied jamming, concentrated around Iranian airfields, which swelled that error circle to 25 meters. Against a building, still a hit. Against a parked aircraft, a crater on the taxiway, and a P-3 that limps to another field. The only way to tighten accuracy was to release lower-cut the weapon's flight time from 90 seconds to 30, less drift, tighter impact. But lower meant the Zu-23 engagement envelope and the MISOC-2's ceiling. The Tormone's 45 seconds were still compounding. Raven 1 rolled in first, at 12,000 feet, 30-degree dive angle, ATF-LIR, locked on the P-3F. 3 seconds from Pickle, the South Zu-23 opened up no warning tone, just orange-white tracers punching through the exact air the Super Hornet was about to occupy, while the gunner walked his lead angle calmly across the dive path with the patience of someone who had been doing this for 11 straight days. 1,600 combined rounds per minute. He didn't need to be precise. He just needed to be close. Raven 1 broke hard right into afterburner, with the release window gone and the bomb still on the pylon. First run scrubbed by a weapon system that cost less than a used sedan. On the rooftop, the MISA-2 operator read the brake heading, altitude, the roll angle that told him exactly where the jet would reappear if the pilot tried the same approach again. 11 days into this war, the Iranians were still swinging, and they were thinking 2 moves ahead. Raven 2 couldn't afford to wait. The IL-76 had been spooling for 25 minutes with possible engine activity, showing on infrared the one target that disappears if they spend another 60 seconds solving the Zu-23 problem. He committed on the heavy transport alone. 10,000 feet, 2,000 lower than his lead's aborted run, pushed into that altitude by a targeting pod the Tormone had broken 40 minutes and 300 miles ago. The crosshairs lifted left past the IL-76's wing route, overcorrected right, settled on the center line for half a second, and he mashed the pickle button during that flicker of stability. The entire weapon solution riding on a momentary pause from a pod that hadn't worked right since the foothills. The GBU-38 dropped off the pylon, tail kit deploying, 4 fins snapping into the airstream as the GPS receiver reached for the satellite constellation. The signal it found was already being contested. The jamming didn't hit like a wall it crept in. Noise flooding the GPS frequency the way static drowns a phone call, the position solution drifting as interference buried the signal the bomb was steering by. Fins corrected by a fraction of a degree. The jamming shoved back. Fins countered. Every correction was a wager between the satellite signal the guidance could still see and the noise trying to bury it 30 seconds of an invisible boxing match through 12,000 feet of contested spectrum. At 8,000 feet, the jamming found a resonance. The position solution jumped sideways by 11 meters. Fins slammed to maximum deflection. Overcorrected, then found center again not through stillness, but through constant adjustment on every axis. A tightrope walk where the wire never stops moving and someone keeps flicking the lights on and off. From the rooftop, the Missile 2 launched. The operator had tracked Raven 2's descent for 15 seconds, waiting for the rear quarter aspect where both F-414 engine nozzles were fully exposed. The jet's missile warning receivers caught the plume at 5 o'clock low. Raven 2 broke hard into the missile and rotated his hottest aspect away from the seeker. The ALE-47 dispensers fired MJU-53 flares, magnesium pellets burning at 2,000 degrees. Temporary suns designed to confuse the same thermal imaging brain that made the Mishawk 2 dangerous. The seeker built its picture and faced a choice. The flares burned hotter, but the aircraft presented a larger thermal mass. The system needed 1 second to resolve the difference. The brake rotated the image faster than the focal plane array could refresh. Image smeared. The missile committed to the nearest flare and detonated 100 meters behind the aircraft alive, flight suit probably ruined, and completely blind to his own bomb, still falling through the last 4,000 feet. The Reaper saw the impact from 20,000 feet forward of the wing root, the fuselage splitting open, the tail section sagging sideways. The APU that had been feeding an engine start sequence for 25 minutes was now feeding fuel to a fire. The IL-76 crew had raced through their checklist while American jets orbited overhead, unable to shoot. The aircraft would never leave the apron. The Mishawk 2 brake pushed Raven 2 south, straight across the Zu-23's firing arc at the south end of the runway. The same gun that had scrubbed Raven 130 seconds earlier was a weapon the Soviet Union designed in 1960 that Iran purchased for the price of a decent pickup truck. The gunner already had his lead angle from the first engagement. He'd watched both passes, done the geometry in his head, and now had a better shot than either time before. Both barrels opened up, and tracers climbed through the space the jet had occupied a half-second prior. At that range and closing speed, the gunner was putting rounds inside a volume the size of a house, and the Super Hornet had to thread through the gaps. Raven 2 jinked through the stream with small, unpredictable corrections, just enough random motion to make every ballistic prediction wrong by the width of a fuselage. Rounds behind him, more fuel gone from a margin both pilots could count on one hand. Raven 1 came back from the northeast on a completely different line. The first run had shown him where the south Zu-23 sat. His wingman's engagement had shown him where the Mishawk 2 operator was pointing. He put the maintenance hangar between his dive line and the rooftop concrete, and steel blocking the operator's line of sight during the 3 seconds that mattered most. ATF-LAR locked on the P-3F, 51 years old. Lockheed built it in Burbank. Iranian crews had learned to fly it at Moffett Field when the Shah was still in power. The airframe had survived the revolution and the Iran-Iraq war on 23,000 man-hour overhauls using parts Lockheed stopped selling when Carter was president. It had buzzed the USS Essex in 2019 American, built and harassing the Navy that made it. Now it was time to return the favor. Pickle. The GBU-38 fought the same Chinese jamming through 12,000 feet of contested air and impacted at the wing root. Fuel cells caught. Half a century of keeping an aircraft alive that its own manufacturer had abandoned, erased by a bomb built 15 miles from the factory that built the plane. The North Zu-23 fired as Raven 1 rolled in on the last target. Both barrels, tracers closer this time, the gunner adjusting from 2 previous passes he'd watched from the far end of the runway. Raven 1 jinked through the stream with the fuel state slashing amber on his HUD, a number that meant the tanker orbiting over the Gulf of Oman wasn't optional anymore. It was the difference between landing on the Lincoln and taking a very long swim in the Arabian Sea. Every second over this airfield was a second he couldn't afford. And he still had one more bomb to put on one more aircraft. The C-130 filled the ATF LIR display another American airframe Iran had bought from Lockheed half a century ago. He pickled. The tail kit fought the same jamming, punched through the interference, and impacted amidships. 3 for 3. The Tormone had bought 45 seconds. Those 45 seconds broke a targeting pod, pushed 2 jets into a surveillance radar's coverage, gave a garrison time to deploy gun trucks, and a missile team handed an IL-76 crew a 25-minute head start and created 5 minutes of complete American blindness over the target. The battery never scored a kill. It didn't need to. It just needed to make everything harder, and for 45 seconds it made everything harder than it needed to be. That's not a miss. That's a system working exactly as designed.